The idea that sex should be saved for marriage is actually incredibly pro-woman. It's man and woman together in a marriage. They're discerning based on their mutual gifts. It's the big missing thing from the working mom debate.
The secular understanding of feminism hits the man against the woman. Women having the quote-unquote freedom, but it's really a freedom to conform themselves to being like men.
If you're going to have a successful career, you need to wait to have kids. It's really vulnerable to be like, oh, wow, I can get pregnant with a whole new human person. It affects you differently than your husband. And I think we have to have a really honest conversation about that.
Welcome to Edify. My guest today is Samantha Povlock. She is the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of FemCatholic. You can find them in the show notes. After graduating from the University of Notre Dame, go Irish, with degrees in business and theology, she started her career in Chicago in consulting and project management. She currently lives in the greater Philadelphia area, which, like a lot of people, live outside Philly. That's kind of a tagline. Outside Philly with her husband, Matt, and their children. So welcome, Samantha, to Edify.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we're so excited to talk. And fellow working mom, I really want to dig into these quote-unquote women's issues from a Catholic point of view today. So I'm excited to talk. First, I'm going to go right for the controversial. So FemCatholic, controversial name, Fem standing for?
It's funny because I came up with the name in 2016 when I started the blog. And at the time, I really liked that it was sort of mysteriously, it could be female, could be feminism, like a toss-up. But people do sort of have a typically a strong reaction to the name one way or another. So it's provocative. It came to me, I would say, in prayer, if that means anything to people. So
yeah, so controversial name. It elicits a lot of responses, and let's talk about the feminist word, the word feminism. This is something we've talked about at Catholic Vote a lot. There's, again, different reactions from Catholics, faithful Catholics, to the word feminism. So I just wanted to ask you, there's a lot of different working definitions of it. What is your working definition of feminism?
I think of the word feminism as just being pro-woman.
So pro-woman in all that means.
Yeah, wanting what is best for women, what is good for women.
I mean, it sounds great to me. So I think part of the controversy, of course, goes with the fact that our culture's version of feminism has been super hijacked, or maybe it was the original feminism, but our society's version of feminism seems to point to men and women being equal, but equality understood as sameness, right? Or, women having the quote unquote freedom, but it's really a freedom to conform themselves to being like men professionally. So ignore being the power given to women by the sexual revolution to basically stop being women because we can control our fertility, quote unquote, get rid of that nasty like pregnancy, breastfeeding, all those issues that drag us down, quote unquote. So I think part of the controversy that we see in Catholic circles is that it's not just what's best for women from the culture's point of view. So when you hear, other Catholics rejecting the term feminism, what's your reaction to that? Or how would you talk to them about why you continue to use the word feminism or feminist to describe yourself?
Pope John Paul II used the word. Pope Francis has used the word. Wouldn't be surprised if Pope Benedict has, but I can't think of a quote offhand directly using that word. So I think there is no reason to be afraid of the word. And for me, it communicates the fact that women have in the world experienced a type of, a set of issues around being women. And some of those have to do with our bodies. Some of those have to do with society, culture, politically. I think you can put a lot of things under that umbrella and then have a lot of discussions about what is good for women. But again, I'm using that word as sort of a directional, I think a feminist is somebody who wants what's best for women. And yeah, there have been people who've called themselves feminists who have different views than I about that, right? Like there's a lot of actually disagreement within feminism. But I don't think that we need to be afraid of the word necessarily. Although I can understand why certain people growing up in certain groups or cultures, to use that word, it means a very particular thing in maybe their circles. And so they shy away from it.
Yeah. So how has that informed the work of FemCatholic? Basically, what inspired you to begin FemCatholic, and what's your mission?
So I actually started FemCatholic, believe it or not, a group of nuns, the Council of Major Women Superior Religious, received a grant from the Vatican, and they put on the conference called the Given Forum. It's now a lay-led organization, but the very first one in 2016 was put on by all of these nuns. And I had the opportunity to go to that very first conference. And the entire premise of the Given Forum was to discern the gifts you've been given, and then the gift that only you can give to the church and the world. And I kept coming back to, I've just had this heart for women and women's issues. I was raised Catholic. I got a degree in both business, so I was very comfortable discussing sort of the issues of the world. But also was reading encyclicals and reading a lot of things in undergrad that I hadn't heard people talk about, but that the popes had written about women. And I thought people should know about it. So I discerned that my gift was to start this blog, FemCatholic, with the hopes of having a conference, and it's grown from there.
That's awesome. So you blog, you publish articles. Have you hosted that conference?
Yes. So, Holy Spirit is interesting. All in God's time, right? I actually applied to join the Given Forum and go to the conference right before finding out my husband and I were pregnant with our first child. So I went to Given 5-6 months pregnant with him. And then I had him. And I think at that point, a lot of people who grow up Catholic, there can be this sense that when you're a mom, maybe you should prioritize other things or you don't have these other calls. So I kind of didn't prioritize launching my action plan coming out of this conference. And luckily, when you make a promise to nuns, they do not let you off the hook. So they followed up with all of us and they said, hey, where is your action plan? Thanks, or congratulations on the baby, but where is your action plan? So I while I'm breastfeeding, I taught myself how to make a website. Our first site I built myself with my accounting degree.
That's awesome. So I wanted to dig a little bit more into, so you're saying feminism is, just wanting what's best for women, and what exactly that means from a Catholic perspective. What is best for women? And again, we're going to touch on super controversial. You already touched on the, stay-at-home mom versus pursuing work outside the home issue, which I think is near and dear to both of our hearts since we both work outside the home. But I want to talk a little bit about the idea of gender roles, sort of what's good for men and what's good for women and how those are related. So just broad strokes, how would you characterize what is good for women when you say that?
Well, I think that as Catholics, sometimes we get stuck in the rules around things. And it's been really helpful for me to remember that Catholic teachings, Catholic understanding of life in the world and all the quote unquote rules are for our best interest, for our good. Now, I also think the church has a responsibility, and we're growing into that responsibility to sort of pastorally respond and accompany people in all of those rules. But I think what's good for women, you would hope that is Catholic teaching and Catholic, and so that's been a lot of my work, is trying to understand what are women's experiences that still need to be integrated in all of these teachings, and how can we maybe look at these things with fresh eyes, not abandoning Catholic teaching, but understanding maybe where the pastoral gaps are. So I was just talking to somebody about FemCatholic's new virtual courses on sex and relationships that we launched. And part of that came out of this growing need we saw for just better conversations around chastity and women struggling, frankly, like in their marriages, not knowing that sex shouldn't be painful. That's actually not normal. Yes, your body's different than your husband's, but like that's not something that's normal. And I guess an example of how I think church teaching is good for women would be the idea that sex should be saved for marriage is actually an incredibly pro-woman idea. And here's what I mean. The more you understand about sex and sexuality, I think the more people can appreciate that women's bodies, there's that old phrase like men are microwaves and women are ovens, like and then that's kind of like a reductive phrase, but there's a lot of intricacy. Yeah, there's a lot of intricacy and beautiful vulnerability in a woman's body, but we are very different than men, right? Our bodies are very different than men. And I think that what is the best environment for a woman to feel safe and to feel free and cared for in that intimate encounter is within a marriage where if children, she's the one who's going to carry a baby in her body and have that vulnerability, that the man is right there with her, right? It's society bringing them together in that way. Or just the sort of like there's this commitment, this public commitment that he is going to stand by her for the fruits of that union. And the lifelong commitment of like getting to know a woman's body, going through that seasonality of a woman's body. You and I both have multiple kids. So I think the more that I have reflected on that, I've come to appreciate this isn't about, sex is bad and dangerous. And, we don't need to to be afraid of or deny people's like the beautiful gift of sexuality that God gave us. I actually think this reframing of, what is a truly pro-woman situation here really lines up well with Catholic Church teaching. I think it just needs to be rearticulated.
Right. And there's a lot of baggage too around the conversation, right? Because there's associations that we make with certain words or terms, or, there was a fascinating article, fascinating meaning just ridiculous article in the New Yorker a couple of weeks ago, talking about how religious couples, the men feel more repressed because there's condemnations of their porn use and masturbation, and women feel, like they're entitled to something. So like religion is harming these married couples because of repression, basically. And the facts of the matter, though, when you actually look at the data and the statistics, they show that religious married committed couples in a marriage are having more sex. They're happier with sex, and long term, they're better life outcomes in general for the woman and the man. And I think that touches on something as well. The controversy over the term feminism is that our culture's, the secular understanding or leftist understanding of feminism hits the man against the woman. Like if it's good for men, it's going to be bad for women, or it's a zero-sum game. There's a limited number of resources. And so feminist is grabbing those resources for the women because we were downtrodden for so long is the narrative. And then, of course, with birth control and abortion, it's pitting the man against the woman and both of them against the child, the fruit of their sexual union. But what you're describing is the church's version of what's good for women is actually also what's good for the man. And then it's also what's good for the child. So it's a much more integrated Trinitarian approach to not just what's good for our women, but to sexual complementarity and all that. So it's much more attractive to me as a person to have, this isn't like me versus my husband.
No,
and
that's, what, that is that scarcity mindset. And I would actually, I would add that I think people with an anti-feminist ideology are actually buying into the same mindset. And so they are responding to secular feminism and the type of feminism you're talking about, and trying to be protective about that. But there's a fear around making space for women there's a fear that making space for women is somehow against men, going to bring men down, to your point, it's not. It's Trinitarian, right? There's enough room for the whole body of Christ everywhere. And I would challenge people to look at the catechism that says it's men and women together that reflect God. And so this is not about a competitive nature. It's about the whole body of Christ and realizing that God reveals himself through all of us, and through the union, like that Trinity. I love that. So we want to make space to understand women and women's experiences and just how the church can grow and expand, I think, to even better live that part of who we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much. I think it's interesting too that we're seeing, again, in the outside the Catholic world, but it infects Catholics too, because we're part of the culture, even if we're in the world, but we're not of the world, but we're still in the world. There's this phenomenon right now as well where young men, Gen Z and younger, they seem to be swinging to the right, more to this like Andrew Tate kind of toxic masculinity conversation. Whereas young women, both inside and outside the church, are tending more liberal and leftist. And I don't know if you have any particular thoughts on that dichotomy, or if that's something that your writers at FemCatholic have wrestled with, is this cultural moment that we're in right now. How do Catholics respond to this sort of demographic phenomenon of young men and women who should be getting together and forming families, and experiencing that joy of the Trinitarian union, but society seems to be pulling men and women further apart?
No, that's a good question. And admittedly, I don't consider myself an expert on, Andrew Tate or toxic.
Well, it's probably a good thing for you emotionally.
Well, and you know what? To be honest, I think there's a lot of truth in that, because I had a time earlier in my life where there are a lot of people in the world saying a lot of things that I would not agree with, right? And I think it's sort of that Jesus' message to the apostles of like, go spread the gospel, and if they don't listen, shake the dust from your feet and move on. Because there's a lot of really good work that does need to be done, and good things that need to be built, and good conversations to have. But keeping your eye towards that bridge building piece, it's not easy, because I think the tide wants to pull you apart, right? That and I do think that's from the devil, right? Doubt, division, discouragement. But the topic of where the culture is heading for men and women is dear to my heart, because I have 2 boys and 2 girls. And so there, I care about both of them deeply, or all of them deeply. And I think everybody wants to be loved and cared for and needed. And I think everybody's trying to figure out where they fit and where, who they are in the context of community. I think the best thing Catholics can do is build in-person community, whether that's with your neighbors, whether that's in your parish, whether that is, starting a women's group, or just, doesn't even have to be Catholic friends. Like, we just had our friends over down the street. They're not Catholic, but they have 4 kids, similar ages, and just building community so that your kids learn who they are in the context of relationships. So they're not trying to form this identity. I think now with social media, kids are really pulled to form an identity, like this public, I don't know, face or mask or box of an identity, rather than just like being a person. And I think there's great variability in personalities, right? You can have, I'm a woman, I have a female body, but I'm very mass inclined. I can be very competitive. I can have these qualities that are a little more masculine. But all of that reflects God. And I think, it's about helping our kids be who they're called to be, and see the gifts they have for what they are, I would say. So, and that's another thing I would love to help women do, is realize the legacy of women in our church is not a narrow, reductive one, right? We have Teresa of Avila, Joan of Arc, Mother Teresa, Edith Stein. And if you really learn about these women, they're diverse. They've got a lot of different gifts and skills. And I imagine that if I had grown up in a situation thinking, oh, wow, my personality is not very meek and mild and demure. That's the only way I'm allowed to be. Yeah. If you associate that with femininity and you associate that with what you should be, and I think it can really start to suppress who you're called to be. And I think people feel that and they retreat from that, which is probably healthy. But I think the more that our church can just build local community and then celebrate the gifts in each of our community members that they see, right? If Joan of Arc was in a local community, what would she look like right now? What would she be doing? I don't think she would be, maybe she would be baking sourdough bread and, wearing dresses, but like maybe not. And so just, I think uplifting and encountering and then uplifting people for who they are, I think is really powerful.
Yeah, I think it's always funny when you hear people say, oh, the Catholic Church is so down on women, or it's all stay-at-home moms and all the same. When you actually look at the saints that the church has proffered up for us as examples, it's like, pick your panoply. It's like Thanksgiving dinner. There's everything. And I think of, modern mothers like Saint Gianna, who was a pediatrician. And then we think of martyrs. We think of the nuns, the scientists. It's everyone. And I think too, we have our Blessed Mother as well, right? We have Mary and her role in salvation history. There's no one the church elevates more than the Mother of God. So I did want to talk a little bit about just motherhood in general and approaching that. As I said at the beginning, we're both working moms, quote unquote, and that's a pretty hot debate. So a lot of young Catholic girls might think, okay, well, if I get married and have kids, then I'm stay-at-home mom for that season of life. Obviously, you've made different choices. Life's handed you different opportunities. So let's start with devil's advocate. Okay, so let's start with what's the best argument from your point of view for why mothers should not work outside the home when they have young children? If you were going to interlocute with someone, for lack of a better word, how would you approach, what do you think would be their strongest argument for that?
So I think that, I guess my brain goes to the pieces of their argument that I agree with, which is I agree that children and raising children is an incredibly important vocation. And in many ways, I don't want to say the highest, because I think God gives people just really multifaceted callings. And I think it's a little bit reductive to try to rank and pull apart. But certainly having children is incredibly important. And for God to entrust those souls to you as their parents, or again, in their local community, right? Like if you are the aunt to children, that you have a role in their life, and you are called to do that really well and really intentionally, and to form your children really well. That, again, I think it can be too reductive to say forming your children well, caring about them, loving about them has to equal XYZ, has to equal you are in your house all day long with your children. You are the person changing their diapers. What does that mean? I think it can mean a lot of different things depending on the family and their vocational call. And one of the first blog posts I wrote on FemCatholic was the big missing thing from the working mom debate, which
I love. I'm going to post that. I loved that.
Oh, I'm so glad. It was one of those things that sort of blossomed out of my own experience with my husband, although he actually is the primary breadwinner right now. And I am primarily home with our kids when I'm not working on FemCatholic. So that was not the way it was for quite some time, and it may not be the way it is forever. But women's lives are very seasonal. But the big thing that's missing, I think, from these conversations is that complementarity piece, and realizing it's man and woman together in a marriage that are discerning based on their mutual gifts and their mutual, situation and the needs that each one of them have, that their children have. What is the best situation for a family in any given season? And frankly, you just don't know who you're going to marry. So I think I see a lot of women nowadays going through high school, going through college, and starting to wonder, oh, if I want to be a mom, should I not get a degree in finance because I'm going to stay home? Or should I not, XYZ? And I would challenge them and say, I know, I have a good friend who worked on Wall Street, started her own company, and then she married an artist, and she is the primary breadwinner, and they have children. Like, yeah, I mean, and she is the breadwinner, and clearly God has given her those gifts and she's using them. So I think that's where it does really come back to gifts. And I absolutely credit the Given Forum and all the nuns, all those, like the beautiful maternal, this maternal leadership in our church for really instilling that in me, because it's been so true. And part of the reason I'm in a season right now of having more flexibility is because I used my gifts and had more of a career in corporate America early on, so I think these things are just so incredibly multifaceted and not meant to be so reductive.
Yeah. And I love too how you're emphasizing the conversation between the man and the woman, but also the discernment, the conversation with God. And when we reduce motherhood to this is the only model that works, this is the only model that's compatible with our faith, is, you stay at home and you don't work outside and all that. Maybe for an individual woman, that is the case. Like, that's her particular, how she's going to manifest motherhood with her family. But at the same time, we're all challenged to constantly be listening for the word of God. And I think of Louis and Zellie Martin, the parents of St. Therese Little Flower, right? That Louis's clock business, he was not a great businessman, right? Like, he didn't do very well with the whole watchmaking thing. And so she ends up being, with her lace business, which just took off, she's the primary breadwinner. And you'd hardly say, oh, well, they failed to raise good Catholic children, right? So it's, I love that the reality of the lived life of holiness, that pursuit of holiness, kind of checks our reductions. It checks our assumptions about what it has to look like for any given family. Something else I wanted to talk about as well, I think FemCatholic has been addressing or wrestling with the issues of sort of maternity leave and policy. What are ways that our culture could better support working mothers without saying, okay, well, you're a working mother, we have to suppress your fertility as much as possible, or like minimize your breastfeeding time as much as possible because we need the most product out of you. Talk to me a little bit about your thoughts on ways that our society, our policies around motherhood in the workplace can better support us as women.
It starts with acknowledging that women's bodies are different, right? And creating that space for difference and not being afraid of that difference. I think there definitely are circles and, cultural leaders that put that binary out there where if you're going to have a successful career, you need to wait to have kids. I think it's really great. We need to acknowledge that, when you are pregnant, you kind of don't know how it's going to affect you, right? I had pretty easy pregnancies with my kids when I was in corporate America, but I have friends who didn't, right? And they were really sick, or it affects you differently than your husband. And I think we have to have a really honest, we have to have a really honest conversation about that. And this is where I want to call on the church to lead the way in what this could look like, because secular capitalism is going to look at the female body and say, ooh, that's not as productive as a male body, potentially, right? It's riskier. And I think that's where good pro-woman people have started the conversation and said, well, we're not just utilitarian, like we are people. but the church, that's where I think we really have a call to lead the way in prioritizing dignity over, and not to say that this is where I have a business background too, right? Accounting, like I understand money and numbers and needing to hit your revenue. But we need to be creative. And Pope John Paul II, in his pro-life encyclical, or what's often kind of thought of as the pro-life encyclical Evangelium Vitae, I believe it's in there. He says, the systems will need to be redesigned to accommodate motherhood. And so I think the church in America in particular, FemCatholic had done some investigative reporting on what are the maternity leave policies in dioceses across the country. And, they mirror the culture, which is that the culture of nonprofits typically don't offer maternity leave paid, or it's not very extensive. Even in for-profit companies across America, it's not very common to have great maternity leave policies. And so it's a really interesting sort of social issue in the United States, because we're the only sort of like industrialized nation that does not have a law around maternity leave. I don't, that gets into politics, and I don't know what the right answer is specifically. I would need to do a lot more research on that to comment on that. But I think from the church's perspective, in countries where there are other social issues, the church is working to respond. And so I want to invite the American church, the U.S. church, to see things like maternity leave policy and the supporting of family, the supporting of working moms, and as a social issue that deserves attention and deserves business people to get involved and respond. That in Pope Paul VI invited, when he released the sort of final word on NFP contraception, and said, no, the church is not going to, Catholic Church is not going to condone contraception. He called upon doctors and medical professionals to research women's cycles, though, and to research the needs that women had. I want to call on business people now to, raise your hand in your diocese, raise your hand in your parish. These are complicated business problems, but they're absolutely business problems that can be solved. The Ascension Press, which is right by me in town out here in Philadelphia, they just released their 12-week maternity leave policy. So Catholic companies, I think, and Catholic business people have the ability to look at these things and make space for women.
Well, and really creating that culture, especially with lay Catholics, since public policy is kind of our sphere, for lay Catholics to really lean into that. I think it would phenomenally help to reverse the contraceptive mentality that seeps into the working mother's life. It's a sort of like, okay, I need a space so that I can get back on my feet with my career. But knowing that there would be that respect in the workplace for the way her body works would just make it that much easier to accept the church's teaching on fertility and contraception and all that. Which kind of brings, I did want to ask you as well, you've written a lot about NFP on FemCatholic, obviously natural family planning, following a woman's fertility in order to work with her body in terms of delaying childbearing or spacing children. And you wrote, this was a quote from one of your articles, NFP is at the heart of the feminist movement for equality. And you talk about birth control, the prevalence of birth control that sort of gave us this illusion of women being like men in all ways, but that just hasn't played out. That hasn't been true, because there is the hidden cost to women on artificial birth control. So I wanted to ask you to just talk a little bit about the drawbacks of birth control and how exactly you see natural family planning in the church's teaching as being the root of feminine equality.
First, I want to start with the reality of all the health issues women navigate, and the fact that our medical system has really failed women in terms of, there's a ton of research on this, right? That there's absolutely not good research into all these different conditions: endometriosis, PCOS, infertility, hormonal issues. Like, it's pretty bad. And so I empathize with women who go to their doctor and are given birth control to manage symptoms. They need medical treatment. And that's another area where I think the church, there's so many people that are working on this issue, but we need to keep working on it, because women deserve good healthcare, and to alleviate their, sometimes the symptoms are pretty horrific and just need to be dealt with. So I do think it is interesting, all the various methods of contraception to impact the dynamics between men and women, because I think the reality people are struggling to come to terms with is, men and women alike, but particularly women in some ways, we have this inbred vulnerability in our bodies. We carry it around with us, and that is vulnerable. Like, it's really vulnerable to be like, oh wow, I can get pregnant with a whole new human person, soul, and then all of my choices are affecting them, and what I eat and that's really vulnerable. And that's an incredible kind of authority that I think God has entrusted women with, to nurture new life at its earliest stages. Men, I don't think by any malintent, but they just are not born with that same awareness, right? Because it's not in their body. How do we invite them into that awareness of this vulnerability? I think the space NFP creates in a relationship is, it sort of forces men to learn, oh wow, her body doesn't work like mine. What can happen? Like what? Like it's sort of this constant reminder, and women are aware of this, right? We live with it. We are aware what can happen. I think there is something really healthy about inviting men into that awareness that, like, hey, even if there's only a 1% chance, like, this is what can happen. And it's sort of inviting him into that vulnerability. Now, you get into all the pastoral. I just want to acknowledge, like, pastorally, it can be really challenging for couples. There are a lot of really good, healthy questions. And that's where I think there just needs to be a lot more built around pastoral resources, pastoral support, even like medical advancements for people. I think we can't be afraid of those questions. I'm certainly not afraid of those questions as being a reason to sort of overthrow church teaching. I think it's an invitation into building out the church and our response and our community around that to support people who need support.
Right. It's still shocking to me how many young couples, like in our parish, we're in a college town here in New Haven, Connecticut. Might have heard of the college here, Yale, but there's a lot of young couples preparing, and the number of them. We had a party here last winter, and there was a couple getting married a couple of weeks later, and the woman who runs our NFP had never met them or been in contact with them. This couple was getting married in 2 weeks, and they'd never heard the church's teaching on contraception because it wasn't in the program that they were like put through. So at our party, they end up sitting down with the NFP girl, who's a friend of mine, and she just like gave them all Humanae Vitae. It was awesome. But they were like blown away by this. And it is shocking to me how, the theology of the body came out when I was a young child, and then Christopher West with all of his efforts to bring it to public attention when I was in college. And now we're 25 years later, and there's still this lack of communication about it in the church programs and bureaucracy. Even if at the grassroots level, I feel like a lot more people are aware of NFP and the church's teaching. Why do you think it has taken? It's taken so long, my entire lifetime, and we're still seeing so much ignorance in the American church about what the church actually teaches about the sexual act and reproduction.
I think that if you are able to articulate why this is good for women with sincerity, not because you're like pushing an agenda. Because I have seen people, people get really jaded when they're taught that NFP is super easy and you can, have sex all the time. And then they find out that it's not, it has challenges, right? Like, you are working with your body's natural rhythms, and it is an intimate, an intimate thing. But I think, there are tons of people in secular culture who are now realizing the benefits of learning your cycle, and just women in general, working with your cycle and realizing all the way from what type of exercise you should do as a woman at different parts of your cycle, and recognizing that even if you're an athlete, you are going to be stronger, literally, at certain times during your cycle. All this knowledge about the female body is exploding in the secular culture. And I would ask the church, clearly people want that information. What's different about the way they're presenting it versus the way that we sometimes are presenting it? And that's a lot of what I hope to do with FemCatholic, is say, hey, this is really good for you in all sincerity and all, and then take all the questions and take all the challenges to that, or work through the nuances to it, because it's multifaceted. But I think if we're presenting faith and teachings as truly being good for people and answering their problems, it's easier to pick up on it. And I think medical advancements are still evolving also. Now you have things like the Aura ring where you can wear it and it takes your temperature. And you have just better technology or better understanding of different hormonal problems. So I do think the medical advancements are still sort of moving along. And hopefully the church can just celebrate where those are. I guess last thing I want to say about that is I think people get turned off, understandably, when they are suffering with, NFP and we can't figure out my cycle, or NFP and we've now had repeated unplanned pregnancies. And like, that's a huge burden. And I think sometimes the church too quickly jumps over that, and doesn't acknowledge that and doesn't support those things. And so people then, they feel unheard, and they don't want to listen anymore. They don't want to engage. And so I actually think that if we can better engage with where people suffer and struggle with these teachings, we'll be better at evangelizing.
Right. When you say the church, who do you mean by that? Because I think like all of us in certain circles, I can think of members of the church who are doing that, who are listening, women like you, women who are in pregnancy care centers, helping mothers of many children, and parishes. When you say the church can do better, who do you mean in particular?
That's a good question. And it is, if there's one thing I've learned I lived in Indiana, I lived in Chicago, and I'm in Philadelphia, even the United States, there's all these different communities, and we have different things that are top of mind, and challenges, and gifts. And I think the church is just each of us in our own way. So, for priests, that's going to be in their priestly role. For me, that's going to be in my role as a friend and a mom and a wife, and doing FemCatholic, because that's something I think I'm called to do. And so I think each of us in our own way need to do that. Sometimes it is just friend to friend. We did a really interesting poll one time back when FemCatholic had a Facebook group a couple of years ago. I asked people, is your biggest challenge or struggle with the actual teachings of the church, or with the, community or individual people that you've encountered, or sort of that pastoral support you've gotten, whether from a priest or just your parish or the people around you? I think 100% of people said it was not the teachings. It's actually just, the experiences they've had. And that actually gives me a lot of hope, because I think what that shows us is people just want to be heard, to be accompanied, to, be heard and held in their suffering. Because sometimes these teachings are really hard. And NFP can tease out challenging relationship dynamics. And I have talked to people who, this was somebody I knew who was not Catholic, so she was Protestant, but actually was having health issues, came to a Creighton charting intro class where they could have started doing NFP. And her immediate reaction was, well, my husband's not going to want to abstain for these periods of time. And there's some dynamics there in the marriage that need to be looked at. And so I think that type of education for couples would be really good, that, hey, not only here's the science of your body, but here's how to navigate all of the different pieces going on. And that may be something, FemCatholic gets into more in our virtual courses, but I think other people are trying to start more of those conversations too.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to your point about building real community and having encounters with real human persons, because when church teaching or an experience like that Creighton class uncovers something uncomfortable or really challenging, or it causes what feels like immediate suffering, if you have that community of persons, like you were describing with your neighbors down the street, if you have that community of persons, you can see those challenges posed to you in your marriage or in your fertility as really the mode through which Christ is going to heal something that's broken. And but we have to have the confidence that we will be supported. We won't be like just left on our own because like you have weird cycles. So, but that confidence can only come when you are loved and held and all of that. And yeah, it's a good examination of conscience, I think, for all of us to ask, like, am I available in the ways that God has given me to be available? And how am I creating that community of support and love? So that I tell my kids all the time when they're fighting and squabbling, or like, do you know when you give your kid a chore and then the siblings are like, no, come do this instead? I'm always telling them, like, your job is to help each other to be good. Like, your job is to support each other in following what mommy says. And it's kind of like the God saying that to us, like, your job is to help each other to follow mommy, the church. And really, like I said, I think your points about building real community are fantastic. A series that I have enjoyed on FemCatholic that's newer, you have sort of my struggle with church teaching on blank, and you'll have like chastity or premarital sex. And one of the most recent ones was my struggle with IVF, which this year has come to the fore because of legal cases in the United States, arguing over in vitro fertilization and how our country should handle it now that Roe v. Wade's been overturned, and some states have laws about the personhood of the child, the unborn child. And I think sometimes NFP can be presented as a cure for infertility, and that's not always the case for every woman. It can be, like, there are other options, obviously. How would you say, we talk a lot about motherhood, how would you approach a woman who is struggling with that cross of infertility, and what that means for her own femininity?
I would want to listen to her, because too often, even, one of my own areas of growth is we're so quick to want to tell people things. And I think infertility is a really multifaceted, painful thing to navigate. And I'm sure people navigate that in different ways, right? That pain is going to come out in different ways. So I would want to just create the space to listen to, what is your experience? What is hard about this? Is it the fact that, your sister down the street has 5 kids and you're still struggling to have your own? Is it the fact that you, there are women who've like had an abortion or used contraception or did whatever thing in the past that now they're feeling guilty, like, this is my punishment that I'm not able to conceive now. It may be because she feels left out of women's ministries. I've heard a lot from single women and married women who have different struggles with fertility, that they struggle to find their place in parishes where a lot of groups are focused on moms and motherhood. And right, it's celebrating motherhood, and that's so beautiful. But where do we see women beyond that? I think that's another, again, this place where the church has the opportunity to grow and just create more space and celebration for, not that we can't celebrate moms, but just celebrating the role of women in all ways. And it's funny because sometimes culture does this. Like, I just saw an article the other day about the importance of aunts. It was in like some secular publication, and talking about how now being a cool aunt is a whole trend, and there's like, sweatshirts. Literally, my nurse the other day at the doctor had a sweatshirt that said "cool aunt," and so I told her, I was like, "Love your sweatshirt." That my sister is like such an important aunt to my kids. Just validating that role, and that it's important to, again, be in community. Because I think that sometimes, especially in America, we're really isolated, and the way you have community can be through those types of things. And so I actually think the more we build, I didn't mean for this to be a whole community rant, but but the more we do build local community, I think we can ease that suffering, not make it go away, certainly, but just encounter each other and remind each other, like, yeah, you're still part of our neighborhood or our family or our, parish. You're still part of the women's group. Like, those things become even more painful when they sort of contribute to your isolation from other ministries. So yeah, I would just want to listen to where that woman's heart is in her struggle.
Yeah, and find ways to invite her into the life of the family that we have too. I mean, yes, so good. All right. Well, I'd like to just end on a fun note, and ask you if you this or that, just quick takes, so our listeners can get to know you a little bit better as a person. So I'm going to give you just a quick rapid fire. You ready? Okay. Ready? So, cats or dogs?
Dogs.
Mary or Martha?
Mary.
That's the right answer. It's what Jesus said.
I was like, wait a second. Yeah.
I know the answer to this one. Yeah. Like, I am Martha, but I pick Mary. Yeah. All right. Easter or Christmas?
Christmas.
Dominican or Franciscan?
Oh, I don't know. Oh, no. I'm a youth science girl, so Carmelite.
Okay, Carmelite. I like it. The third way. Okay, spicy or sweet?
Spicy.
I love it. We're like the same person. Okay. Well, this has been great. For anyone who wants to know more about FemCatholic and hear these voices and do that listening that Samantha's been talking about, I would send you over to the blog and all of the good work that they're doing there. It's in the show notes. Be sure to check it out. And Samantha, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.